Good afternoon and welcome to this interactive live streaming event by Retail Week Connect, produced in association with Sage. I'm your host, James Knowles from Retail Week Connect, and we're here today to discuss GDPR, are you prepared? It's the question keeping all retailers up at night at the moment. We're just about a month out, so a very topical issue for today. And it's so important for the industry because any data breaches could lead to fines of up to 4% of global revenue or 17 million, whichever is more. So today I'm joined by an expert panel. We've got Emily Strickland, who's Marketing Manager at Networld Sports, Ian McDonald, who is Regional Instructor at Sage, and Laura Freeman, who's Data Protection Officer at Barstool. So we're completely interactive today, so if you've got a question, pose it in the field below and I'll ask our audience. So how have you, your particular role, tell me about your role, how have you come towards GDPR?
Sure, so my role is obviously very marketing focused as marketing manager. So initial focus has been around reconsenting as much of our database as we can as possible. But as we've been talking previously, GDPR touches across all departments, and it's really been really key for us as a business not to be biased towards, say, just marketing, because it touches across logistics, production, everywhere. Right, okay. And Laura?
So as Data Protection Officer in Barstool, I'm looking at everything, spending a lot of time with different departments, doing a lot of fact finding, understanding where we hold data and why we hold data. So from your point of view, Emily, it's working with marketing alongside finance and our distribution network. There's so many different touch points. So initially for me, it's been very much about finding out how what we do is impacted by the new regulation, so that I can spend time figuring out how we start to either change the way we work if we need to, and certainly work on documenting policies and things like that. But it's been primarily around a great understanding of the business and leaving nothing unturned.
Right. And of course, Ian, you work with lots of businesses, so you've got a really multi-varied view of what they're doing and how they're prepared for it. So can you just tell us a bit about how you work with retailers?
Yeah, so from a GDPR perspective, we've got two projects ongoing, essentially. So we've got the internal project, but I'm primarily involved with the external project, so the education side of things. So educating Sage's customers on both the regulation itself and also how the software can help them on the path to compliance. So bits of functionality in the software that can help them in terms of where they store their data, how they manage it, making sure it's as safe and secure as possible as well.
Perfect. So we've got a really sort of cross-section of views here today. So for our audience watching, this is your perfect moment. So just a few weeks out, hopefully everyone is prepared, but you might not be. Maybe you don't have the resources to devote all the time in the world to it. I think we all know that feeling. Or perhaps, you just want to benchmark your preparations against your fellow retailers. So now's your chance to do it. If you've got a question, do send it in. You should see a field below, and I'll pose it to our panelists. So we've heard about how you personally are working in terms of GDPR within your own business. How prepared has your business been for GDPR and its imminent onset?
Sure, so we've taken a bit of a two-phased approach really. Initial focus for us has been on the consumer side of it, and educating consumers why they need to reconsent. Because I don't think there is that much out there as to educating them why they need to reconsent.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. And then the second phase of it has been internally, so making sure that we've got all of our policies, our terms and conditions, all of our ducks in a row really, and then an education piece as well for all of our employees, because GDPR isn't just about kind of one person sitting on a spreadsheet ticking all the boxes. It's making sure that everyone in the business is aware of why it's important and doing their bit to help the business become compliant.
Right, okay, so talking to lots of different departments.
Yes.
And right, so it's a long process really to get that buy-in from everyone within the business.
It is, yeah. Getting buy-in is the most important thing, but having a positive attitude towards it I've found has helped massively. I don't know about you guys. But for me, it's massively helped communication within our business. Like we're speaking, like we don't have an issue with communication in any way, but you speak to people that you wouldn't necessarily speak to day to day, and you get to understand their processes and their challenges, and it's actually quite eye-opening, I found.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time with different departments understanding how they work. I've held a role previously within Bath Store around internal operations and understanding how we can grow and develop as a business. And this has just opened a lot more doors to understanding the real inner workings of the business and the things that you didn't even know you needed to look at for GDPR. And understanding the legislation can be really, really complex. It's only when you get into the real nitty-gritty of each department do you start to understand actually all of the things that you do that are heavily impacted by the legislation. But same for us, it's definitely opened doors of communication, and getting buy-in has been, it can be quite challenging, because I don't know, any of us would disagree, it's not exactly the most entertaining of subjects when you're trying to discuss it within your business. Yeah. Someone sees a meeting headed GDPR, they're all running for the door rather than the actual meeting room.
Snacks always help.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of cake going around in my meetings at the moment.
Drive them in.
Yeah, but I think for everybody, if you can try and keep it as engaging as you possibly can, I think part of the reason that I'm running this project, I've tried to keep it simple and engaging. You can't do this this level of work and engagement on this topic if you don't try and bring it to life. But you also can't do it if your company don't back you with buy-in. So it's a huge element of what we're working on at the moment.
The education piece is really, really important. And if that's leading to greater collaboration between businesses and within the business, then fantastic. Because even the accidental release of data could have really financially damaging consequences. So, as I say, if it's bringing companies together, then that's definitely a good thing.
Well, it should result in a much more sort of uniform data management strategy, shouldn't it? Which I guess is the whole impetus of the legislation. Ian, you obviously work with retailers, as I say, across the board. How prepared do you think the industry is for it?
I think it varies significantly. When I run the webinars for Sage customers, the first question I ask them is on a scale of 0 to 10, how they would rate their current knowledge of the GDPR, and give them 3 options essentially. So they've got 0 to 3, 4 to 7 and 8 to 10. The most prominent answer I get by quite some distance is 0 to 3. So there isn't really that awareness out there, and I guess maybe surprisingly, maybe not, that hasn't changed. So started delivering the webinars in the middle of December, even delivering them this week, still get 0 to 3 as the most prominent answer. So even 4 or 5 months on, and now only a month out of launch date, that level of knowledge hasn't increased. I have seen a slightly more broader awareness since the ICO started their advertising campaign on the radio, certainly in the micro business community, because you're hearing about it on the commute to work, and also because people are receiving communications from other businesses saying we're ready, talking about things like the preference centres and opt-ins and consent. People are hearing about it from other businesses, even if they're not hearing about it from the authorities.
Right, okay. Is that worrying that we're a few weeks out and people are still giving that response of 0 to 3?
It's surprising. I certainly think it's surprising. I'd certainly expected that would evolve and that there would be at least that broader awareness that people might put themselves to go back to the polling question in the 4 to 7 camp, where there's at least a little bit more awareness but still need that education piece. We're only a month out. Education's only the first part of it, and as both Emily and Laura have said, to say the least, there are a lot of practicalities.
I think once you know, and only when you know, do you realise the potential undertaking of what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And it's only when you know. So I think if you're in a position where you are 0 to 3, that could be quite scary. It might not be. It might be when you do your initial fact finding, you're working in a GDPR compliant manner, which is great. But I think you would definitely be very naive to not do that fact finding. And I think my question for you, Ian, might be about confidence. Do you think it's more about the confidence people have got? Because from what I've seen, I mean, we've engaged with consultants within Bath Store to support us on our journey. And I think if we hadn't have done that, we wouldn't necessarily have had the confidence to fully understand the legislation. Do you think in smaller businesses not doing that might be a risk, and it could be a confidence driver that you're getting that 0 to 3?
I think so. I think there's a lot of worry out there as well, because data breaches are so high profile at the moment. Certainly from the time I've been delivering the training since the middle of December, it seems that barely a week goes by without there being another high profile data breach, leading to quite significant fines. And when people hear about the fines being quite significantly ramped up under the new regulation versus what it can be under the existing Data Protection Act, there is a real fear out there. A lot of worry about, is the onus going to fall on me as the individual, rather than the company. So if we don't get the GDPR right, is it me that's going to get fined? Is it going to fall on me rather than the business as a whole? So there's a definite fear, there's a definite lack of confidence with hopefully with education and getting to grips with the practicalities will at least disseminate a little bit, hopefully.
I think to touch on that point, I think there potentially is the awareness. I think it's more the bridging of the gap of the actions required to become GDPR compliant. I think people know it's coming and it's kind of like this thing that we don't talk about. But in terms of getting them from A to B, I think that's where there isn't that awareness.
I think certainly from the training perspective, that's where the owner's shift has come. For all I guess the score on the education hasn't evolved. There's a lot more questions now around the practicalities. People are becoming very conscious that it is only a month out now. So people need to learn and get that education up front. But it's okay, now I get the theory. What do I need to do about it? I've got a month. What's the first thing? Probably the most common question I get asked now is, what's the first thing that I should do practically to set myself on this path to compliance?
Right, okay. And do they have time to get prepared in a month?
Depends. To Laura's point, really, in terms of you might have very little amounts of personal data, you might have significant amounts, you might have a huge amount of departments, you might only have a few. Some people might be compliant already. If in the main you're compliant with the Data Protection Act, then by and large you should be okay with the GDPR. If as an organisation you're not, you could be a long way from home and therefore a month won't be enough time.
I think it's a simple case of you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And until you look, you've got no idea.
Right. So moral of the story is worth looking now.
Definitely.
So that
not
you
stick your head in the sand.
Absolutely.
I think you probably have a brief freak out looking now if you realise that you're actually behind the Data Protection Act. Because if you're not in line with that or near that, you're probably going to be some distance away from GDPR. But that shouldn't, burying your head in the sand now will not help. I think one of the key parts that I've been learning about the legislation is a lot of it is around your plan as a business. It's not just about the 25th of May, that is it. A lot of it is about making sure that as a business you're on a journey to getting where you need to be. So if you're not ready now, just start planning.
I think certainly one of the maybe more common misconceptions is around, well, okay, let's kind of forget about the data that I've got now. It's only the data that I get on or after the 25th of May that I need to be compliant with. Anything that I hold at the moment doesn't matter because we're not there yet, but it's all the data that you hold, so it's going to be really critical to review the data that you hold. Do you have a lawful basis for holding it? Have you received consent if you needed to? I think there's people are drawing a line in the sand for the 25th of May and almost disregarding what happens up to that point.
Right, so it's not so black and white, which brings me on to my next question really, which is particularly both for you, Emily, and Laura, as the retailers here. What has it meant for you then practically about the data you hold and how you use it?
Not a lot really, because we found that a lot of our processes are in place. It's more of a case that no one's really communicated them to each other, or we haven't documented them in any kind of formalised way, or collect them in, have them stored collectively really, so everyone can access them. And that's what it's been about really, is collecting all that knowledge and those processes and documenting them really.
Right, okay. Same for you, Laura.
Similar, I think as a part of a larger business, because obviously we've got our 160 stores, we've got quite a lot of tying them together. The policies, as you say, the processes, they exist. We're on a re-education plan now, making sure that everyone is following them to the letter and committing to them as well, getting buy-in from them about really understanding that this policy is not just a piece of paper, it's not something that you need to follow, there's ramifications if we get this wrong. So I'm on an internal profile raising piece constantly at the moment. So I work within our support centre in Welwyn Garden City. So with my colleagues, trying to educate all of our departments on the importance of really understanding it, and we've got some great people. They do care, they really want to understand it, so we're having some really engaging conversations about how we move forward, and to your point, Ian, about making sure that we're not just looking at what from the 25th of May we've got, but historically as well, why we've got it. And with our store colleagues, just getting them on board with everything that we're doing and being clear really about what is a breach, what do we need to do, and we've touched on it around understanding actually your position as a business but your position as an individual as well. I've had a lot of people ask me the question, if I sign a policy that says I'll do this and I don't do this and I get it wrong, am I personally liable? So it's quite interesting that I think people are trying to take a a view that it could impact them personally, and also that I don't want it to use it as a scaremongering tactic, but ultimately you get more buy-in from people when you could be personally responsible. But it's been a long journey with Bastar. We've had work to do. A lot of it is in place, but it's just tightening it all up and making sure it works effectively. But I think we've moved mountains with communication. Yeah. It's been fantastic. We've seen a lot more engagement departmentally. I think people have come to the conclusion that whereas you may be able to work in some cases insularly as a department, for instance marketing, discussing how you're going to run your next campaign, actually now it's become a business-wide conversation. How does that impact the data? What do you want to do? Where did you get the data from? And there's a lot of questions now that we were definitely thinking about, but we're now engaging as a full company, not just individual departments, which is great.
I think to pick up on Laura's point around finalising the education just in the last month is really important. One of the messages that I've looked to convey in the training is around you need to hit the ground running. On the 25th of May, I think there's perhaps a little bit of a legacy with recent legislation changes like real-time information in payroll, automatic enrolment in pensions, where there's been a bit of a lead in time and a bit of perhaps a 1-year hiatus before fines might get given out. So organisations might be a little bit complacent in terms of, okay, I've got the deadline of the 25th of May, but I've probably got a year after that before I need to be compliant. It's not the case at all. So that's your launch date, that's your date to hit the ground running, which is the phrase I've already used. And maybe not think, but I've got a bit of time after that as well. So it's really, I've got more than a month if I think about it.
So there could be a rude awakening to the tune of 17 million. So it's something they need to prepare for. Absolutely.
Could happen, yeah.
Absolutely. Ian, you did speak about how it's not just new data that they'll be collecting; it's old data as well. And we've heard from Emily and Laura what it means for how they collect and store data and use data. What's the advice that you're giving to retailers on that, on how they collect, how they store, how they use data? What are the sort of key pieces of advice?
I guess a couple of things really. So in terms of practicalities, and both Emily and Laura have touched upon this, first bit of advice I would give, if that's not already an ongoing concern, is to have some form of data audit across the organisation and within departments, so to document, even in the form of a simple data inventory spreadsheet, that you know what type of data you have, where you got it from, where it is, who's got access to it, you understand your retention periods, how long you should be keeping the information for, which organisations you share it with, if you transfer it to other countries. On the back of that, so if you undertake that audit and you identify that you've got data across maybe 15 to 20 different platforms, to then look to consolidate that information, it's going to make your life so much easier if you can go from having 20 different bits of software or databases or whatever it might be to having perhaps 4 or 5. And also ideally in an online portal where possible, because online portal technology really is considered to be industry best practice for keeping data safe and secure. So there's nothing in the GDPR that says you can't have paperwork, there's nothing that says you can't have backups, you can't just have data that's not in the cloud, but it really is about the appetite for risk and making sure that the data is as safe and secure as possible. But you can't keep it safe and secure if you don't know what you've got and you don't know where it is to start with.
Right. And you spoke a little bit about how prepared the industry was in terms of, a certain number of people saying 0 to 3 in terms of, why do you think that is the case? Why do you think there's perhaps, a lack of, in some quarters, a lack of preparation almost?
I think in the main, if I think about recent legislation changes that I've touched upon already, like RTI and auto-enrolment, there was a lot more awareness in terms of advertising campaigns around them. Certainly when we went through RTI from an education piece at Sage, it was marketed by HMRC as the biggest change to payroll legislation for 70 years. So there's a real fear factor to it. It must be a significant change if it's changing that much since, the Second World War was the last time we had that change. Automatic enrolment was new to a lot of organisations. A lot of organisations didn't offer pensions to their employees at all, and that was very heavily advertised. It's only in the last month or two that we've started to hear the advertising campaign from the ICO on the radio, as I alluded to earlier. And it's only on the back of perhaps bigger organisations sending their communications out that the smaller organisations have even heard of this. I think to Emily's point, people at least knew that it was coming and maybe the taboo subject, but nothing more than that. But it hasn't been prominent in the way that previous high-profile legislation changes have been.
100%. And I think I read an article this morning, it was in Marketing Week, and someone had alluded to where is the consumer-facing campaign for it? I think because we're not seeing it out of our kind of day-to-day professional lives, it's kind of like, well, is it coming? Do I need to do anything about it? And I think it just needs to be a bit more real life, I guess, really.
Yeah,
and that would raise the awareness.
Yeah. I even get asked quite a lot, does it apply to me? It's a very common question, and you know, so if people are smaller businesses or one-man bands or might work in a particular field, or even charities or non-profit organisations, very much getting the thought of, well, this won't apply to me, it's only going to be for organisations with more than 250 employees. And almost always the answer is yes, it does apply to you, and that actually might be the first kind of real rude awakening, I guess, of actually I was perhaps expecting to hear that I don't really need to worry about this, but fundamentally I do, irrespective of the type of organisation I am, even down to things like private members clubs. If you have any form of personal data, then you do need to comply with the regulation, which is now only a month away.
Right, it's coming around soon. So do you think because of that, because it's not been so in the sort of public consciousness, which again is surprising because it is going to have ramifications for everyone, do you think within retail in particular there's been a sort of a lack of understanding too? Like, for example, in your businesses, when did you begin work on GDPR?
Yeah, so we began towards the tail end of last year, and it's taken us a good few months to become ready. I've totally forgotten the question that you've asked me.
When did you? When did?
Because we take for a drink.
It's all those hours whiling away working on your data. That's it.
It's a fascinating subject, isn't it?
It gets us all eventually. So, in your business, when did you begin working on GDPR? And do you think that, you know, was it recently? Was it a long time ago? And why do you think your business began working on it then?
Yeah, I purely think it's from the individuals inside the business. They had an awareness, and we knew that it was important to us. So we knew that it was important. We do a lot of our marketing through email. We're an online retailer, so ensuring that we had as many people reconsenting from a marketing perspective to our database was really, really important for us.
Right. Okay. And what about you, Laura?
We engaged back in May last year to understand the scope. So as I mentioned, what we have and where we have it. We were at that point engaging with consultants to basically start the project. And at that point it was very much around, right, you need to log everything. We need to know what you've got. We need to know how you manage it, how you work with the consumer data you've got, your employee data, your contractors. We've got a lot of different data within the business that until you start really delving into it, you suddenly go, oh yeah, we've got that bit as well. And that's what we did back in May. We did a full scoping project, and then it's gradually just ramped up and up and up from there, working through the different actions that we have. So all of that fact finding generates into a really long action list of where you need to tighten, change, review. Because ultimately the policies that we have, they all need reviewing. They all need to make just that little tweak to make sure that you're in line with GDPR, not just the DPA. So there was basically 6-7 months of solid work of finding and really understanding. And now we're just at the tail end of the project now, just finalising things and working on awareness. So we have started advertising within the business about GDPR for quite some time, but now it's that real ramp up awareness. But from a marketing perspective, I'm sure they've had their eye on this for quite some time. Understanding about consent, how we're going to change, why we're changing, what we need to say, and then obviously the engagement with legal teams to understand how we say it. So I think there's been a lot of talk about the tone of voice that we use, because to your point, I mean, I've been subject to a lot of these emails coming through, and obviously everyone's got a different take on it. I think if I wasn't sat in the position I'm in now as a data protection officer, I'd be quite confused about what everybody was doing, because it just seems everyone's suddenly asking you to opt back in. And obviously I've spoken to my family about this. My mum's like, what is going on? So I don't think there's been much out there for the general public, but I know internally it's been a long journey.
I think that's really indicative as well to Laura's point around how late people have been to the party in some cases, clearly not in these two cases, but even larger organisations are only now sending those communications around, this is what you need to do to opt back in, and this is the reason why, and we are only a month away. So if the awareness piece isn't there even for the bigger organisations, then that's not going to filter down to the micro businesses as well.
I think in some cases your strategy might leave you later in the party to be talking about your consent changes and things like that. So I don't know that the actual landing of the email is indicative to the preparation of the business. That could just be the strategy. But ultimately, I think there are probably a lot of businesses out there that might end up in that last ditch moment of we need to send an email, and who knows what that email is going to end up looking like. But it definitely needs the thought now.
Definitely. From a marketing perspective, we slaved many hours over, you know, what words should we use, because it's got to fit with our tone of voice as well. We don't want to lose our identity. We still want to be Networld Sports when we're communicating with our customers to, you know, enhance that chance of them resubscribing with us. So definitely many arduous hours over. Should we say click here or view here? Or
I know we initially went in with an IT approach. It was definitely led by our IT department back in May, simply because it was about where's your data. It's a very IT driven thing. It's only as it's migrated further along the project that it's actually moved into a much wider business position of how do we manage each individual department. So it's sort of GDPR in our business has took its own little journey around our departments, and I'm now just heading up the changes that everybody needs to make.
Well, that journey is reflected in the fact that we have two different job functions here discussing it, so it really is business specific, isn't it? Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely, and it can be very niche depending on the business, especially around the data that they have. And talking about the businesses that are compliant with the Data Protection Act to not rest on their laurels with the GDPR because of the widened scope. So, because the online world that we live in now, there are things that are classed as personal data in the GDPR that aren't in the Data Protection Act, even things like social networking posts, mobile device IDs, IP addresses. So you do have very, very niche situations depending on the type of business, and it might have a significant difference from where they are now with the Data Protection Act. It might just be business as usual depending on what data they hold.
And that's why it's so important to draw on all the departments. Like one individual, you know, you can kind of try and champion it through your business, but you've got to pull on everyone. You know, for example, you just can't just hand it over to marketing and be like, okay, off you go.
Yeah, you can't have a weakest link because the consequences are quite could be quite tough. So some interesting insights then from both of your businesses and from you, Ian, working with lots of businesses in the market. So just a note to our audience, does this sound like the questions that you're having within your business? Does it sound like the preparations you've put in place behind the scenes? Maybe you want to ask one of our panellists a question. Now's your time. So if you'd like to send in a question, please do write it in the field below the screen and post it through, and I will put it to our panel and get you the insight that you're looking for. So Ian, again, we keep on saying it, but a few weeks out or a month out today, perfect timing for today's webcast. What sort of advice are retailers coming to you now? What advice they're coming for?
In terms of the questions that I'm getting asked, they mainly fall into one of two boxes, I would say. A really prominent theme is around retention of existing data. This can depend on the organisation, but some organisations will have data going back decades, if not centuries. Really one of the key parts of the GDPR is around personal data should be retained only for as long as is necessary. So depending on your organisation, you'll have a statutory requirement to keep different amounts of data for different amounts of time. So you've got payroll information, you'll have VAT records, you might have recruitment information like unsuccessful candidate CVs, and really understanding how long you're meant to keep that information for. Because beyond that, really, if we look at the principle of the GDPR, you should either be purging it or anonymising it. I think broadly, a lot of organisations just kept everything for 7 years in line with accounts, but it's very different depending on what data you have, and therefore you do need that understanding. So it's, hang on, we might have a lot of data here that we need to go through, and we might need to either get rid of in its entirety or at least redact or anonymise. The other questions probably get asked in the main are very relevant to what Emily and Laura have said around marketing, particularly in relation to consent and the need for a positive opt-in and a positive affirmation. So it's no longer acceptable to have a pre-filled tick box that says, if you do not wish to receive marketing information, untick the box, and you can't use silence to mean that it's a yes because someone hasn't said no. So the questions around, does this mean we have to go back potentially to our entire customer base to get that consent? And now, to your point, Ian, James, we've only got a month to plan how to do that. So in the main, around what do we do with our existing data and how do we make sure that we do have the right level of consent, especially around marketing and in particular electronic marketing as well.
Right, okay. So questions you've already asked in your businesses because you're a bit further down the road. But of course, we talk a lot about consumer data, particularly from a marketing perspective, opting in or opting out to receive certain communications. But it's not just about consumer data, is it? Ian, you just mentioned keeping CVs and stuff like that. It also relates to employee data and the data, your internal data pool, if you will, on the people who work for your business and that sort of thing. So can you tell us, and supplier data, of course, as well. So can you tell us about that side of things? What do retailers need to be thinking about there and know?
If we look at employee data, the good news, it's nice to have some good news, is that for payroll data it's pretty well defined. So in order to pay someone, HMRC require you to have very specific bits of information about somebody. So you have to have someone's name, their address, their date of birth, their national insurance number. And because you need to have that information, you've got a legal requirement to have it. That in turn means you don't need consent, which makes life easier because you're fine to have that information to fulfill your legal obligation. Just need to be wary about other bits of personal data you might have in an employee's record, so things like next of kin information, emergency contacts, if there's an accident at work and your requirements under health and safety obligations. In the main though, you do have a legal basis for having that information without consent. What you do have to remember though, is what we've already touched upon are those retention periods, so it's making sure that you don't keep that information longer than is necessary. HMRC currently requires you to keep employee information for the current tax year and at least the previous 3. Again, beyond that, you need to be thinking about purging it, redacting it if it's paper-based, or anonymising it in some way.
Right, okay. And then obviously in both of your GDPR activities, you've had to speak to departments across the business, haven't you? So what have your conversations been like with your HR departments, for example, on what you're doing in terms of employee data, or other departments in terms of supplier data and that sort of thing?
Sure, it's just been finding out kind of what data they use, how they use it, and kind of doing a data audit. That is the best place to start, and just, like you said, just fact finding and finding out what information you have, and then from that creating a bit of a risk register to understand what implications that can have if that data did get leaked or if it got into the wrong hands at all. But it's just really championing those departments and giving them the confidence as well to just go and do it, and just, if they need a little helping hand, saying here's what I've done for marketing, or, like that. I mean, nobody's perfect, and I'm sure people won't get it right first time round, but you've got to start somewhere, and like Laura said, as long as you've got a plan to get to where you need to go, I think that's the most important thing.
I think it's a great point around the documentation side, because it's something that we get asked for a lot at Sage in terms of templates. So
just going to say, this regulation didn't come with templates, and I think people are quite freaked out by this. And I think one thing we've definitely had to do, you just be logical. Attack this like you would attack any other project. Figure out what you're looking for. Why do you need to do it? What do you need to do off the back of what you've learned? It can be so simple. I think you've eloquently put quite a lot of things about the legislation, which unfortunately is not easily accessible. There's a lot of documentation out there. Simple Google on GDPR is going to bring you a lot of information, but they're in words that people don't necessarily understand. I think if you are struggling, I think you're best to seek the advice of someone who can translate what is being written there. So there's a lot of things you've just said about details of the legislation. I've never quite heard them put in such a way that is very, very clear. Without that clarity and without templates, I think a lot of people are like, what do I do? Where do I start and how do I attack this?
Yeah, it's bridging the gap between the theory and the practicality. So, okay, right, I now, for example, I now understand that, I'm going to get a subject access request. I've only got a month to turn it around now. Fine, give me a template. So if someone asks me for their information, give me the form that I can give out to that data subject so they can fill it in, and give me the functionality in the software, for example, that I can just churn it back out again. So I get it now, but what do I actually practically need to do? And that documentation will be a huge help. So if you're, again, collaborating within departments. So,
Excel is my new best friend.
Well, it's probably a good place to start. But you're talking about that collaboration. If a department within a business has come up with something,
share it.
Yes,
because
definitely.
that really is, from my experience, what people are after. The nearer we get to the date, hopefully the more the theory is ingrained, but I need to start making those practical steps. Give me something to help me with that.
But then others in the department as well, or in other departments, will modify it and say, have you thought about this? And that's why it's so important to involve everyone in the business, because everyone has a different perspective. As a marketeer, I will only have one viewpoint, and can be quite tunnel vision in that way,
Yeah.
whereas someone in logistics might have a completely different requirement and need, and it's important that you get those viewpoints.
Yeah, because you don't want one part of the business to be left behind, do
No,
you, in terms of...
definitely.
You can't run that risk.
No.
You need, ultimately, as particularly, and we've said we're heading it up within our businesses, there is no room for having a department left behind. And I think when I initially started a lot of the communications from the business, I don't know if you found this, but when you're requesting information, there's a distinct lack of understanding, and sometimes it doesn't matter how eloquent I put the request. It's not a drive for people to understand GDPR. It isn't that interesting. So it's really engaging with people and being able to explain what you're asking for, because it might seem very simple to us in the world of GDPR, but actually when you're putting that request to someone else for information within another department, while sharing best practice is great, but if you don't give real strong guidance, a lot of the things I send out are headed with an example. There's an attachment and an example, so that there's real clarity around what you're trying to achieve. Otherwise, a lot of your requests might just get lost, and that's not going to help you through that fact-finding stage, because that's just going to hinder you. And like you say, could run the risk of having a department that you need to help a little bit more or ends up left behind.
Definitely.
Those tangible examples are really useful as well,
Yeah.
because to your earlier point, Laura, around because it is very terminology based, it is very much wrapped up in legalese.
Yeah.
If you can provide that clarity by saying, okay, this is what the particular article says, this is what it means.
Yeah.
In reality, this is what I need you to do.
And I think if you can find someone within your business that simplifies complexity, it's that simple. If you can't do that yourselves, my advice would be seek outside support. You're doing webinars on it. You've got the experience there. It is available to everybody. Utilise it. If you can't figure it out, just admit it really and carry on and find someone who can support you through your journey. So your webcast, sound great.
webinar's fine.
Webinar. So I'm still catching up with this terminology.
Webinar.
Yeah.
We'll run with webinar.
Yeah.
It sounds like a great place to start if you're very new to the whole thing and need a whistle-stop tour of how you as a business are going to be impacted.
It's
Or
bringing it to life.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think the best way to kind of communicate GDPR is verbally and getting everyone in a room. Do not become a keyboard warrior and sit behind emails, because people will ignore you, and it's just better to get everyone in a room. It saves people's time. I know people are very, very busy within businesses, but an hour in the room where you get your head down and you get a clear action plan, and people can ask those questions openly without kind of it being on an email and then potentially feeling like, oh, is this a stupid question to ask? Because, 5 other people in the room might be thinking it as well. So it just saves all that back and forth and is so much more efficient.
There aren't these stupid questions, are
No,
there, isn't it?
no, definitely not.
As we've already said as well, people are going to be bombarded with emails about the GDPR in their private life, because they're getting emails from who they bank with, who they've got their TV with, etc. So if you're going to communicate it via email at work, people are going to have the mindset of it's just another email about GDPR and maybe not take it as seriously as they need to. So absolutely, that face-to-face communication, that education piece is really important.
Yeah, and I think consumers potentially view it as a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, there's been a lot of bad press, around various data breaches. And I wonder if consumers just think, oh God, this is companies getting a bit worried, and they don't see it as an EU initiative, or they don't know that it's, this big EU initiative.
And we spoke about sort of plain English and sort of being able to simplify complex new legislation. Is that, from your perspective, working with lots of retailers, do you find it's one particular type of job function that drives this change in a business, or is it, like we say, somebody who can just simplify it and get more people to sort of engage with it and buy into it just because they can explain things in a sort of accessible way?
Absolutely the latter. I couldn't agree more with Laura on that point. It's having someone to, put it in the context of my webinars, having someone to come on who can then have it simplified for them, make it tangible, make it understandable, to then educate the wider business. And to an extent, it doesn't really matter who that person is, as long as they have the ability to understand it and to convey it in that simplified way, because it's the kind of things we try out in the training, but there's 99 articles, it's got over 55,000 words. It's a pretty hefty bit of legislation to say the least. So having someone who can do the legwork for you, both in terms of the reading aspect, the simplification aspect, to make it simple to educate the wider workforce is key.
I think your key point there is making it tangible. You've got to get it to relate to how it impacts that individual in that business. Otherwise, building traction is actually quite difficult, because it's just words, and impact But how it impacts you is what's most important. That's the only way that you, as an individual, as the person within your business who needs to champion this, is ever going to be able to really understand the gravity of what you're dealing with. So yeah, I think that is very important.
Yeah, so how it's going to impact you
Yeah.
and making it accessible. It can be quite hard to make things simple though, actually. So as the people doing that in your businesses, you're doing well. Just a month out. Okay, and then so are there any other sort of practical tips or areas of the business where you've had to really sort of like focus on and look in depth into as part of this?
It's probably been our distribution or our logistics data. We obviously ship all over the world, so working with logistics has been a key focus for us, really, and making them understand why it's so important. And at the moment there is potentially, people see it as a marketing kind of function, but yeah, just that awareness.
And when it's logistics, what does that mean? Is that supplier data or delivery address
Delivery
data?
addresses and all information like that.
Okay.
So yeah.
Right,
very
so they'd
personal
hold that
information. Yes.
information, right, okay, right.
We've been quite
Similar.
fortunate in that because we work with much larger supply chains. So they're in a situation we're already getting the reverse communications.
Yeah, I mean, we're in that. As
so
well.
very similar. I think, thankfully, a lot of the people that we work with are very much on board with the regulation. They understand it, and everyone's just doing their due diligence back and forth, really, to say we are a you, and they're saying we are a you.
That risk.
And that, it's just sort of saying, you're aware of what you do, and we're aware of what we do. But I think it's been a long journey to just understand everything that we have. No one department has been harder than any other, but I think one piece of advice would be, it's a new regulation, it's very much focused around non-paper. Do not forget about paper. It still is a thing, it still exists, and I think there's a lot of businesses out there who might look at the regulation and it is very data-driven, IT, hacking, all of these words that make you forget about a simple piece of paper. Paper is still key in this, and obviously one of the things we focus on within particularly our store estate, we have paper, we have quotes, we give customers information on a daily basis to transact with us in a sales environment. So we've had to make sure that in all of our initiatives we incorporate paper, which feels a little archaic and is putting us further on our journey to being paperless, which is where we want to go as a business, pro-green initiative. And this just works hand in hand with it, but don't forget paper and cabinets.
It's a great point now, because talked about kind of common misconceptions from education earlier. There's so much emphasis on high profile data breaches, online breaches, and an awful lot of emphasis on that's why the GDPR has come into play, which is absolutely a fair point, that is the case, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't include paper data. There's certainly a misconception that as long as I get my online data in order, that's all that this regulation refers to. It's not. I guess, for want of a better way of putting it, the old-fashioned method of keeping data on paper. This is an online thing, that's why it's come in, that's all I need to worry about, which absolutely isn't the case.
Right, okay.
If only.
Would be similar. Paperless office, maybe one day, but I don't think we're there yet.
Absolutely. We've got about 15 minutes left, roughly, so if you've got a question for our panel, do send it through and we'll ask the question. But I'm conscious that a lot of the businesses watching this webcast today might be behind the curve in terms of where they're at with their GDPR preparations, or depending on the size, perhaps they don't know, they don't have lots to do, but they might have a lot to do. So in case you're one of those, do send in your question. But for those businesses, if you could give them sort of, key tips and takeaways of, the really important things to think about that you've discovered as you've gone through your respective journeys and your businesses, and the tips that you're giving in. What would they be? So Emily, what would they be from you?
My first one would be get business buy-in. It just makes everything so much easier if others in the business are willing to help you. Like I've said, you really can't do it on your own and you need to speak to all the other departments. I guess my second tip would be the ICO's resources. We found that, I don't know if you guys have found that at all, they are really, really useful, and they do kind of bring it back into layman terms, I found, so it is a good starting point. A good starting point also is to do this data audit or this kind of fact-finding mission that Laura's spoken about.
Right, okay, right.
That would be my advice, is don't pretend this doesn't impact you. Don't be naive to think that naturally it doesn't, just based on the business that you have. Really think about it. What we found within our journey is the more we thought about, the more we talked about, particularly with departments around a table, discussing the ins and outs of what we do. It's only then that we found a good 5% of what we didn't know. So there's lots of things we do know, the mass data, things like that. But then you have a little conversation with someone and all of a sudden you've got something else that you might need to address. So get people together, talk, encourage conversations within departments as well. Don't just invite the stakeholder that you feel is the most appropriate person. Get them to talk to their people as well. Because in a bigger business, you may have a person that owns and runs the data. It doesn't mean they're the regular user of the data. So just make sure that you cover those angles and spend time together, talk. Do not be, your keyboard warrior? Don't be a keyboard warrior. Talk to people, engage, and don't bury your head in the sand.
Right. And so from your perspective, Ian?
Break it down into education and practicalities again. So education, obviously there's some excellent online training out there. I think I've ticked that box.
Where would you get that, Ian?
Well, I'll move on. Starting off with the education, to then educate the business. The practicalities, we've all said it, I can't emphasise enough the ability to do a data audit, to know where your data is. You can't really do anything beyond that until you know what data you hold. So get the buy-in, educate, and make sure that you do know what data's out there and that you do have a reason to have it as well.
Right, okay. And of course, it's not going to, all of these preparations, they don't just stop at the 25th. So what happens after that date? Are you both going to continue overseeing this in your respective businesses?
Yes, definitely. So we've not really labelled it in any way, but I guess we've got a champion team, really, of departmental managers who've then been cascading it through the business. And then we'll just continue to work to be compliant and to improve our processes. Because you can't just, this information can't just sit on a spreadsheet. It needs to be continually reviewed and updated, and new things happen all the time, especially in the world of digital. The only constant is change in digital for us, so we need to make sure that we're keeping up with it.
Right, okay.
And you can't just tick a box. There's no one box you can tick to say we're now compliant. And
we're done.
Yes, and that will never evolve. It's the 25th of May, box ticked, we're now good until there's a future change. It's absolutely not the case. There's a lot of different things you need to do, and it is going to evolve both in terms of the regulation, but in the organisation itself.
It's quite cheesy what I'm about to say, but data needs to stay alive in your business. You keep talking about it. To your point, the only consistency is change. We're an ever-changing business. We're always working to see the next initiative and how we grow and develop. If we start ignoring what we've done, we will put all of the hard work that we've done, it would just be gone, because with no discussion over your next project around data, you could become non-compliant. So everything that you've done to be GDPR compliant could simply go out the window by not having the same conversations that you felt the need to have prior to the 25th of May. So I think it's had a massive profile raise within our business. It's all worked into our governance structure. We're talking about risk with the board. It's basically going to be a constant theme now. It's always been there, but it's been underlining, whereas now it's very high profile, making sure that we continue to tick the right boxes, we continue to have the same discussions. And also, you need to audit what you're doing. If you have your policies and your procedures, I highly doubt if one falls down and 2 years down the line you've not reviewed it in 2 years, which is what you said you were going to do, the ICO are not going to be particularly impressed with that attitude. It's not about now, it's about now and ongoing. So there's quite a lot of work to keep going along with this. And don't be naive to think it just stops.
Keep your eye on the regulation as well. Emily's already referenced the ICO site, which is a really, really good place to start. But every time you go on it, there is further guidance being added. So around things like privacy notices, they've added really good guidance on this is exactly what now needs to go on a privacy notice. They've got examples of really good privacy notices and very helpfully really bad privacy notices. And say if you leave it a week or two, revisit the same articles on the ICO site. There's more and more guidance being added. And once we get beyond the 25th of May, we'll start to see precedents as well. Organisations will make mistakes, will then be live with the GDPR. It will give us something more tangible again to actually say, right, okay, this is what this organisation did incorrectly. We know to do things differently, and it should get simpler, hopefully,
Yeah.
the more guidance we get, but also once we've got precedents as well.
Right, okay.
I think the key thing is kind of little and often,
Yes,
really,
yeah.
with GDPR and kind of all your data, really. Just
Yeah.
making sure that you're keeping on top of it, because then it won't become kind of this monster that you have to tackle
Yeah.
again, like probably many businesses are facing right now.
The last thing you want to do is end up in the face of the ICO explaining why you didn't follow through with everything that you should have. And if that's not enough of a risk, and 17 million, I'm not sure what is really.
Well, that should hold people accountable, shouldn't it?
Just a bit.
But I guess there are opportunities in it as well, cleaner
Yeah.
data,
Oh,
more effective
100%.
data.
Yeah,
100%.
So it's not sort of mitigating a sort of, a negative introduction. Actually, perhaps it could make your data
Definitely.
more
I mean,
effective.
from a marketing point of view, we can't wait. I mean, we did kind of a bit of a mini cleanse of our database towards the tail end of last year to kind of understand what impact this could potentially have for us. So yeah, we are hoping for higher open rates, higher conversion rates, higher engagement rates, and yeah, you're only going to be marketing to the people that you want to hear from you, which can only be a positive thing in my view.
Totally agree with that. It's the putting a positive spin on it, but you might have a much smaller consumer database you can work with, and maybe not as much that you can do with it, but it should be much better data, cleaner data. You're more likely to get some buyback from it as well.
Definitely.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, and so we've got a couple of consumer questions come through, and we did speak about paper in businesses, so here's it in action when technology fails. A couple of viewer questions. Can you start with the basics? What is GDPR? Why are the regulations changing, and how? So we've covered a lot of it, but just give me simple answers to that. Yeah.
Now
Is there a simple answer to that one?
No pressure.
I think it's kind of protecting the consumer at the end of the day, or the data subject, which is it's often referred to, and that's all it comes back to. It's protecting us all, whether it be you and I, or kind of like granddad and grandma. Just ensuring that our data isn't used improperly, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
And also making sure that if the data you have, you did say we could have it, and we're using it for the right reasons. So it's quite simple.
I'm all for.
Yeah.
I'm all for
Your time to shine here. This one.
no pressure. I'm all for compartmentalising things. For me, from an education point of view, to keep it really simple, if it can ever be really simple, I'll put it into two boxes. The GDPR, it's either about the security side of things. So because data breaches are so high profile, it's about making sure that our data is as safe and secure as it can be. The other box around the GDPR is about the rights that individuals have to make sure that that data is used in the right way. That you do have a right to object. So if you are receiving marketing and you don't want to, that you do have a right to know what information companies hold on you. So again, it's a massive piece of legislation, but very broadly speaking, keep it simple. Make sure the data's safe, and make sure that the rights that people have in relation to their data are stuck to. And if you're doing both of those things, then you won't go far wrong.
Right, okay. Indeed, well answered. And then, of course, Brexit's looming. You might have noticed that in the news. Obviously, this is will this still have an impact once we've left the EU? Will we still have to abide by it?
Yeah, I think there is this perception that because we won't be part of the European Union anymore, it won't affect us. 100% it will, and yeah.
Really common question that we get asked on the webinar. So there is clearly a 10-month window when we have to comply between the 25th of May and when the UK is destined to leave the EU next March. But relevant to this kind of legacy of, there won't be fines for the first year and that kind of thing. Well, actually, if we only have to comply for 10 months, we'll probably get away with it, but it's not the case. It's going to be business as usual beyond next March because the new UK data protection bill's already going through Parliament. We've already said that we're going to comply with the GDPR even when we've left the EU. So, in a nutshell, really, organisations need to make sure they're compliant from the 25th of May. Can't use Brexit as a reason not to be. We will not be in the EU anymore, but from a data protection perspective, it will be exactly the same beyond next March.
Right, so you've not been saved by the Brexit bell, unfortunately. And then I'll just ask one more, and they've been flooding in, as you can see from my paper. I know at Sage you work with large scale of businesses, right, from sort of small businesses up to large businesses. How does this affect small businesses like farmers who claim that they hold no data? Do they hold data? They're just not. They
almost certainly will do, and it's one of the kind of, I guess, making things tangible again is understanding what personal data actually is. And simplest way that I get my head around it is if you can identify someone from that data, then it probably is personal data. So if you might be a farmer, but if you do have a supplier, if you have customers, you will have contact names, which are personal data. A mobile phone number you might think isn't, but if that's registered to an individual, it would be. An email address could be personal data. If it's got someone's name and where they work, you're going to identify someone from that. So I'd be surprised if anyone didn't have any personal data. It's just understanding that actually things like business to business does come into it. So if it's company data, if you can identify an individual from it, it's personal data. As I say, a phone number can be, an email address can be, a Facebook post can be. So unless you really are in a silo where you don't have any names, phone numbers, contact details, you will be impacted by this.
Right, okay. Well, you'll be relieved to know there are no names on these questions. So are we GDPR compliant? The answer is yes. So you're practicing what we preach.
As long as you shred the paper.
Absolutely. So that brings us to about time. So a big thank you to our panellists. Really interesting discussion. This webcast will be available on demand. So if there are other people within your business that you think could benefit from listening to our insights today, then please do pass it on to them for them to register. They can either opt in or opt out. And that's all from us today. So a big thank you to all of our audience for watching. And this was brought to you by Retail Week Connect and Sage. Thank you.